All right, Mr. Brill here. 5:30 in the morning. I'm going to see how much I can do in maybe the next 10 minutes before 20 minutes before going to work. So congratulations, HOC. You've just gone through the first 2,200 until about five. You've gone through the first 1,500 years of China's 5,000-year history, 4,000 years. The first wave. So let's look at what you've been through. The Shah, Shang, and the Western Zhou Dynasty. You'll remember I told you the Western Zhou is the peak of the wave, and after that the Eastern Zhou is the crash. So this is what it looks like. This is what you've looked at. There's the wave. There's the Shah. Things get more interesting and more evolved with the Shang. Things peak with the Western Zhou, and then things crash with the Eastern Zhou. So I'm going to give you a review here, and I'm going to try to do these from now on, now that I've got technology, in before your unit. So stay tuned for a Wave 2 pre-test video, screencast along these lines. So let's just review, though, for the final exam. The Shah Dynasty. Our dates aren't real exact. You'll see all sorts of things. I know that on our study sheets we say 2000 to 1600. Other places say 2200 to 1600. So again, I've told you before, don't get caught up over the exact dates of the Shah. We've talked about how it's not historically verified, and that question yet, because the Shang didn't used to be verified either. We talked about the geography and how important that is, how it all started on the Yellow River. You know those states now. We know that the Yellow River is China's sorrow because the less soil, which causes flooding. Picture the Mississippi River changing course, say in Mississippi or Tennessee or further upstream, and instead of flowing down where it always has in the past to Louisiana, it suddenly changes course and flows into, say, Florida. Think of the devastation that would cause and the political and social disorder. Well, that's China's story. The Yellow River is really unstable because of that less soil. We talked about the mythology and how radically different China's ancestor myths and what they show about their views of nature are from the Western, with our biblical myths of Genesis. One myth that we talked about was the flood. In the West, the flood is a punishment from God for evil humans. He kills every single human and animal, just everything, because he says, quote, in Genesis, mankind has become, quote, wicked, and so he regrets creating them, and every single person is now evil, and so he just wants to wipe the slate clean. There's only one good man, and that's Noah, and he tells Noah to build that ark. That's the flood story in the West. In China, we see a completely different thing. We see some emperors saying, wow, we've got a natural disaster, we've got a flood. It's more of a Hurricane Katrina thing, right? So how do we fix it? And Yao chooses Shun, which is really, really important. This question of merit, Yao chooses Shun instead of his own sons to rule because Shun is a better man. So this question of succession pops up real early. We also talked about comparing just the Chinese view towards the unknown versus the Western monotheistic view of the unknown. China's origin myths, to the elite in any case, and we'll talk about this later, refuse to go places where they don't have certain answers. So the question of, does mankind or the universe have a creator? Who is it? What does he think of us? All of that doesn't come up in these things. Instead, all they do is, well, we know that it started with, we know that Fuxi was our first, the guy that invented families, told people to get married instead of just breeding like animals, and created a social unit called the family, which is radically important for China. It's, if anything comes close to God in China, it's the family. So he created this social bond, this unit called the family, and he also created, you'll remember, the other thing that in terms of what we know now from archaeology and evolution is true. We've got evidence all over the place. domesticated animals, not farming yet, but domesticating animals. So we've got a food supply. And then, just to recap the Fuxi, we go from Fuxi to Shennong. Shennong created calendar and ritual. No, sorry, Fuxi, and then Shennong created what? Oh, the hoe, the plow, agriculture. So there's our Neolithic revolution and Chinese prehistoric myth, oral history. Agriculture, so now we've got villages and all that sort of thing. So there's your second ancestor. The third ancestor is Huangdi. Radically important. You'll today learn that Qin Shi Huangdi is the first emperor of modern China, which is 2,000 years old. So Huangdi, he's the ancestor that all Chinese say their blood goes back to. He's the father of all the Chinese. He's the one who created chariots and carts and boats and riding and conquered other tribes to create a state along the Yellow River. Pottery, bows and arrows, defense institutions, all that sort of thing. So, in other words, we see the birth of civilization, which again, in terms of archaeology, first we had farming villages, and over centuries, life became easy enough for people to start inventing stuff, and trade to blossom, and social classes to emerge, and cities instead of just little farming villages, with hierarchies and all that, and writing, and literature, and art, and all that. They happen under Huangdi. Then we have what? Yao and the flood, looking for a good man. Yao creates calendar and ritual. Calendar is important. You've got to know when the season starts so you can plant and harvest. Ritual is important back then. It only makes sense since you depend on nature to give you harvests, good harvests. You're going to try to please nature through rituals so that your farming is a success. Farming will be China's economic and value foundation for the rest of its history until the capitalists come, the Westerners, in the 1800s. So that's calendar and ritual. And then finally we have Yao choosing Shun, as we've already talked about, a peasant. The fact that Shun is a peasant is also really significant. You'll learn later. Because China will be, name me another civilization that has peasants who rise up and become emperors. It happens several times, from the first Han Dynasty emperor to the Ming Dynasty emperor to our famous Mao Zedong, who came from peasant stock. And it all goes back to their earliest myths, where we have a peasant become the successor to a king, Shun, because he's a good man, he has merit. Then from Shun we have Yu, and Shun gets Yu's help for the same reason. Yu is the best man for the job, merit, and Yu becomes the legendary first emperor of the Shah Dynasty, of the Shah. So with Yu we go from prehistory and myth to possibly history. Economically also, silk is already invented. It's an amazing gift that will be China's major export item for the rest of its history, and it will make China incredibly rich, and if you'll notice, elegant. Jade also comes up. So that's the Shah in a nutshell. So we go from the Shah to the Shang, 1600 to 1050. Remembering the Shang, if you think of Greek history, the Trojan War, that was the early stage of Greek history. Violent, military, Mycenae, Agamemnon, the city of Mycenae, the big Greek city, is just a warrior city. And the Greeks are basically Vikings there. That's why they go across the Greek Sea, the Aegean Sea, to Troy, on the coast of Turkey, and invade it and plunder it, because they're just military Vikings. It's not a very virtuous stage of Greek history. Later, Athens is a much more advanced civilization. Well, in the same way, the Shang is China's pretty much Mycenae. Pretty brutal, pretty barbarian, but interesting and important things happen there. We've seen through archaeology that they did human sacrifice, that their distribution of goods, there was a big rich-poor gap. City walls show us that they had, military war at that time became more common. It only makes sense. Cities start cropping up along the river, and they start competing for resources, so we see a big push in military. Chariots come to China, probably from India or even further east, but who cares? It's also the Shang Dynasty. Notice the blue, right? So anything that's blue is Shang. It's also when writing, our earliest evidence of writing. Writing could have gone back earlier, but funny thing, they wrote on silk and bamboo, and so silk and bamboo are both going to rot over the years. They're organic, and so that's why we don't have anything earlier. How many centuries before they started scratching into cow bones, ox bones, turtle shells, were they writing? It's a big question. We don't know how long China has been literate, but the oracle bones are our earliest evidence. We talked about the discovery of the oracle bones. Whoops. The discovery of the oracle bones, the guy that had malaria. I told one class of toothache. I was wrong. We know that there was a social hierarchy there again. The most important thing is this. The king was the priest. He was the one who interpreted those oracle bone divinations, messages from D. D, that's their religious beliefs. So we see already our first family thing, Fuxi, right? He invents family, the earliest ancestor. Well, here in the Shang, family's still important because the king's family talks to D. The spirits of the king's family talk to D, and the king has to keep those ancestors happy in order for them to report good things to D, so that life will be good, the harvest will be good, the wars will be successful. And ritual is how they did that. The Shang did that through ritual bronzes. So we'll go to bronze inscriptions. We have lots of beautiful bronzes, masterpieces. No other civilization has come close to what the Shang Dynasty did with bronze in terms of artistic technique. And finally, that pictographic script. And the thing that you've got to remember there, you've thought about it, it was not alphabetic. And because of that, two really important consequences. One, no matter what language you spoke, it didn't matter because it's not alphabetic. It's not a script that tells you how to sound out words. Instead, it's pictures. And because of that, no matter what language you spoke, you could learn to read the Chinese script. This creates unity among all the different tribes because, again, they speak different languages, but they all read the same script. And the Chinese values, I'll show you a picture of the word for ancestor is literally a picture of a penis. So that shows that anybody who reads that is going to see this idea of family has to do with the male line, not the female line. So even if you're a tribe that comes from the female line, it's matriarchal or matrilineal. Over time, just reading this pictographic script is going to sort of fill your culture with the values that are from the culture that made that script. Family and ancestors, that's male, right? So this gives an advantage to China because not only does it allow ancestor or other tribes to read their work, but it also, in a very subtle way, brainwashes them into accepting sort of the biases of the culture in that language and the values. The second thing that it does is kind of reverse. So first we see that unity. China will become more and bigger and bigger and bigger. More and more tribes will just assimilate into China because of their script. But on the flip side, not many people have the luxury and free time and the money to pay tutors and teachers to learn the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 characters that it takes to be able to read and write. So you see an elite class, and this is to me awesome, an elite class of writers and readers. It's called the Literati. And this Literati will go on to play a huge role in Chinese politics, Chinese culture, everything. And it's because they're the ones who have the freedom and the intelligence. You know, just because you're rich doesn't mean you're smart enough to memorize characters, to write well, to read sensitively, all that sort of thing. So you have an elite that is based on how literate you are, how good with language and ideas. That all starts in the Shang. Well, the Shang is overthrown, as we know, by the Western Zhou, by the Zhou Dynasty. Whoops. So, and you'll see here that I've got two little, I've got a bright red going up, because this is the peak of our wave, but of wave 1. But then I've got a darker red going down, because that's where it crashes. Remember, the Zhou is from 1050 to 220, so it's an 800-year dynasty, and only the first 300 years are the peak. So let's follow the peak first. We know about the Zhou through the Shu Jing. It tells us about Zhou Shen, and Zhou Shen is that last, I think I told you guys his name was Shen Di, which also works. He was that last Shang emperor, the orgy-loving king with his perverse roasting humans and his lake of wine and trees of meat and orgies with concubines on his royal garden and all that sort of thing. Well, he's the Pope, right? We've seen in the Shang that the king was the priest, so he's more powerful than the Pope because he's also a military leader. The last king is so corrupt that the Zhou kingdom on the Wei River overthrows him, and because they have a problem with explaining how they could kill the Pope, whose ancestors keep the heavens happy, God happy, they come up with the most fortunate piece of propaganda in Chinese history, the idea of the mandate of heaven. And that idea, as you know, is that heaven only wants rulers to rule if they're good. It's not about family anymore, it's about goodness, benevolence. Rulers who are good to their children and good to their ancestors, rulers who are sincere in ritual, who are benevolent and good-willed, and who are literate above all. You have rulers who are surrounding themselves with the smartest people, merit. The Western Zhou is the period of the first Chinese classics, the Confucian classics. So here's our connection to later in Confucius. Confucius read about these guys in the Shu Jing, which is the history of the Western Zhou, the Shi Jing, which is the poetry of it, or the songs, the odes, and the Li Jing, the Book of Rites. We even, well, according to tradition, the Duke of Zhou wrote that Book of Rites. So, and finally, the last huge, massive thing, Tian. There is no more God, there is no more He up in the heavens. It is now, because a different tribe has a different religious belief, just this impersonal, natural force called Tian, which is translated as heaven, but is really more, it's bigger than that. It's just nature. So as I said in class, if you can picture gravity being an invisible law of nature that we can't see, the Zhou seem to me to picture morality as that too. Nature doesn't have to be intelligent to have a moral law, and that moral law is, if the emperor, the ruler, the king is not all of these things, then that ruler loses the mandate, because Ten is moral, and it doesn't like immoral people. So we had the revolution where King Wu, over the two, King Wen organizes a rebellion but dies before he can pull it off. King Wu pulls off the rebellion, kills everybody in the royal family except Zhou Xindi's son. And then King Wu dies, and his son is too young, and so the Duke of Zhou, King Wu's brother, says, I will be regent until Wu's son is old enough to take the throne. That's the Duke of Zhou regency. And we know that that causes a civil war. They left that youngest Shang son alive, and the Duke of Zhou's older brothers, who have been made vassals over in the Shang territory, side with him. Civil war breaks out, and the Duke of Zhou and the young king put down that rebellion of the brothers, and in the process they expand. And so you see China grow from the borders of the Shang and the Zhou, and it expands much more. And notice what we're looking at now is a very small slice of today's China. So you're gonna understand how it expanded over all of these centuries. And then finally, because we expanded, how do we govern this massive territory? We used to be this little kingdom on the Wei River. Now we're the Wei River and the Yellow River Valley, the plains, all the way over to Shandong and south and north of that. So Hunan, Hebei, Shandong, Shanxi, all of that territory. How do we govern it? And they do it through feudalism. The loyal allies of the Duke of Zhou during the Civil War, and the family members who were loyal, either generals or family members, trusted people close to the Duke, personal ties, are given control of different regions of the new dynasty, the new kingdom, the new territory. And that's feudalism. And when we say given control, we mean that they basically rule that area. They don't. The king doesn't tell them how to rule. It's theirs. They can rule how they want. These people are called feudal vassals, and their territory is called fiefs. And the idea behind feudalism is we trust each other because we were battle brothers, and so we will never betray each other. If I, the king, ever need any support from you, my vassals, who I've gifted with fiefs, authority, power, wealth, you will come to my aid. So that's Zhou feudalism. And you know what? It worked for 300 years. From 1050 to 771, you had 300 years of peace, of prosperity. The vassals were loyal, and the rule was benevolent. And this is why this is our peak. All right? But after those 300 years, the Eastern Zhou is our crash. The Eastern Zhou is broken down into two periods, spring and autumn, and warring states. Sorry, my cell phone just went off there. So the Eastern Zhou is broken down into two periods, spring and autumn. And warring states. And you know how it started. That's why I tell you these stories. These stories are both fun and important because they're ways to mark the plot of this story. Just picture a movie. You've got that king with the concubine. Last Western Zhou king. And he abuses his power, which is not good in terms of Tian and the Mandate of Heaven, by jerking around his vassals and having them send armies to come to his relief every time he sets a false alarm with the warning fires from the walls against the barbarians. And finally, he cries wolf one time too many. This time he really does need them, and nobody shows up. And the Western Zhou capital is burned. Now, for those of you who didn't catch it in class, or didn't remember it, now understand that this is why we call it the Western Zhou, because they originally had their capital on the Wei River. But at this point, the barbarians came in, they burned down the capital. They killed that emperor, by the way. It's maybe a fitting death. But the Zhou family itself, the survivors, they fled, and they went east to the Yellow River. They created a new capital city further east, and that's why we call the period after the burning of the capital the Eastern Zhou, because now the capital is in the east. And this begins the crash, because the Zhou kings are now weak in almost every way, 2 out of 3 ways. The Shang kings and the Western Zhou kings, they were political masters, they were military masters, and they were ritual masters. Well, the Eastern Zhou kings lost their political authority, they lost their military authority, but they did not lose their ritual authority. They're still the Son of Heaven. But in terms of these other two things, politics and military, that's taken over by these guys called hegemons. Who are the hegemons? It's been 300 years since the Duke of Zhou awarded these vassals to his allies, and those hegemons, therefore, are nowhere near as loyal because they don't have the personal ties to the Zhou family, the royal family, and so they become disloyal. They start competing with each other, and what follows is war and loss of unity from 770 to 220, the Eastern Zhou period. So the Golden Age is over, and we've got a 500-year civil war. That's our crash. It's over. The Golden Age is over. Rulers have become ambitious, violent, uncaring about their people. Life is miserable for 500 years. America thinks that losing unity for 4 years in its civil war was a crisis. China lost unity in the Eastern Zhou for 500 years of war. And this is our first lotus blossom. So here comes our rise to wave 2. The first lotus blossom, as I call it, the 100 schools of thought. All of these rulers of the Eastern Zhou during the Warring States period and the spring and autumn are looking for political advisors to help them figure out how to have an advantage over their competition, their other competing states, warring states. And so the main 100 schools of thought, there are many more, are Confucianism, Taoism, and Legalism. They all have solutions to the problem. How do we set things right in this age? Now, you've read Confucius. You should have a basic idea of Confucius' solution. Confucius' solution was, how do you do that? You go back to these guys. You go back to the Western Zhou. You go back to the mandate of heaven. That's how you do it. So he was an idealist of the Western Zhou. As you read in the Zhuangzi, and as we'll talk about in class, the Taoists didn't really think that humans could control massive political problems, and that instead it's personal wisdom. Look, life is suffering sometimes. Things always change. So you just got to have the strength and the wisdom and the mental hygiene to flow with it like water. The Tao is easy if you have no preferences. Yin changes to Yang and Yang changes to Yin, and you've got to be able to accept those changes and flow with them like water. And have a good time. You know, this Zhuangzi, he's a clown. He has a great sense of humor. Enjoy your life while you're here. And then the legalists, though. They criticize the Confucians as naive, silly idealists. What worked 500 years ago can't work now. It's a different world. And they also disagree with the Taoists because there is a solution, and to them the solution is law. The two main legalist philosophers are Lord Shang and Han Fei-tzu. And so the three of these, during the Warring States period, the end of the Eastern Zhou, they are all different schools of thought going around trying to persuade different rulers that they have the right answer. It's still the Zhou Dynasty. It's still the crash. None of them wins. They're all just different philosophies. So how does this crash of the Eastern Zhou end? You know your dynasty song, so you know who comes next. Wave 2 begins with the Qin Dynasty. And that's where I'll stop.